Hi, where's our picture?
Hello. Okay, sorry, everybody's supposed to be muted, but I am gonna just mute all again. Sorry, but we have a large crowd coming and we're gonna get started in a minute. Lots of people coming in, so give us a second. Okay. All right, I'm gonna get started. Oh, more people coming in. I gotta move my thing over so I can admit people while I'm talking. That doesn't work. Hold on. I mean, it does work, but then okay. Excuse me. Okay, we are going to get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Julie Zuckerman, the author of the Book of Jeremiah, which you might have seen when you were registering on the website. I am very excited to welcome you to the February Literary Modiin author event. Before I introduce today's authors, some of you are new to this event, so I want to take a minute to tell you about Literary Modiin. For those of you who aren't familiar, Modiin is a planned city in Israel, about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and it's not far from the airport. So once the airport opens up, please come and visit next time you're here. We have a large population of English speakers in Modiin. So in June 2019, right after my book came out, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers who are here. And we held several in-person events. And when the pandemic hit, we switched to an online format, which allows us to hear from authors and to welcome attendees from all over the world. I am going to share my screen for a minute so you can see all of the books of the authors we've hosted. Let's see if I can get this right. And where is it? Hang on. All right, maybe I won't. Oh, wait, oh, here it is right here. 1 second. More, no. Hold on. Share screen. Here it is. Okay, so you can see a bunch of the books that we are going to hear about tonight: Rebel Daughter, The Yellow Bird Sings, and Forget Russia. And we actually already have the March event planned, so these books are in here also: Florence Adler Swims Forever, The Face Tells the Secret, and Meisel in the Lean Years. And Avi, I think you're here, so wave if you're here. And I'll send out this link tomorrow when I send out the recording, but I encourage you to check out all of these books. I'll scroll down, hold on so you can see, and support our authors. So, the format of today's event is that each author will be speaking for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. We have a large attendance today, so please, so everyone's on mute, but you can put your questions in the chat box. And if you have any technical difficulties, just send me a message. We're also broadcasting this live on Facebook in Literary Modiin, I think that's working now. So if you're in Literary Modiin, feel free to start a watch party. And as I mentioned, we already have the March event scheduled, and I'll put the link to sign up in the chat box. So if you want to already sign up for our next event on March 21st, please do. So now I'm going to introduce the authors that they're going to speak. I just decided I'm going to they'll speak in the order in which I read their books. So first up is Lisa Bordetsky-Williams, the author of the historical novel Forget Russia. She has also published The Artist as Outsider in the novels of Toni Morrison and Virginia Woolf, the memoir Letters to Virginia Woolf, and 3 poetry chapbooks. She is a professor of literature at Ramapo College of New Jersey. Now I think I have to unmute you. Sorry.
Okay, here we go. I'm good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you for everyone coming. And also I'm so excited to be speaking with these other incredible writers, Lori and Jen. I wanted to start out my presentation with a quote from the contemporary Russian novelist Ludmila Ulitskaya, author of The Green Tent. And she says, "It's fascinating to trace the trajectories of people destined to meet." And that was such an important quote to me. I actually put it in my novel because what I'm looking at in Forget Russia is these interlocking connections between people across 3 generations, across space and time, and people who are somehow destined to meet and change each other's lives. The book looks at 3 generations of Russian Jews journeying back and forth between Russia or the Soviet Union, depending on what time it is, and the United States during the course of the 20th century. And the journey from one country to another really symbolizes this sense of transformation and self-identity. The journey is always tied up with self-transformation. Nobody takes this journey and ends up on the other side of it the same. And in a sense, the novel explores this kind of intense longing tied up with Russia that spans 3 generations. And I believe it's the longing for the place of origin and home. So so it would be any immigrant, wherever their home and place of origin would be, I'm sure there's always this intense sense of longing. And whether the place of home was just 10 years or 20 years ago that they left, or whether it was 1, 2, 3, or even 4 generations. The book is based on my own family history. I basically spent my whole life writing this book, believe it or not. So I can say it's my life's work. I'm so excited that it's out. I spent a lot of time doing research. I want to tell you a little bit about my family history and that informs the book. That it really, the first is the story of those Jews in the Ukraine before and after the revolution. My own grandmother and great-grandmother, they lived in a small Jewish shtetl called Gorno-Steipol. And I recently just read an article by Sharansky, a beautiful article in the Tablet, and he says the years of civil war after the revolution, when power in Odessa seesawed back and forth from faction to faction, as hunger, pogroms, and destruction decimated the population. So I'm using his words. He put it perfectly, that after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, for a while, the Bolsheviks, the Civil War took place there. The Bolsheviks lost power in the Ukraine. And it was just these crazy factions. Like from day to day, you didn't know who was in power, the Ukrainian nationalists, different factions of the White Army. It was so unstable. And then, of course, by 1921, when the Civil War is over, these retreating armies, and the Bolshevik was able to establish power in the Ukraine, but the retreating defeated armies go into these shtetls and pogroms happen. And sadly, my great-grandmother, Zlata, as a young woman, was raped and murdered during this pogrom. And, you know, I really wanted to imagine and to bring the history alive. My grandmother was she was very young, a very young teenager, and her father had already deserted her and her mother and was already in America. And an uncle took her in, and he locates her father. And by 1921, this 16-year-old Sarah is on a ship headed to America not knowing, what lies before her. She's headed to her father, who has a new wife and 2 new children, and a stepmother who doesn't want her there. So in a sense, the novel, looks at that time period to really bring it alive. And also she meets in America a man much older than her, about 17 years older than her. And based on my grandfather's story, he came here in 1908. Very, very different. I didn't know until I was really researching the family that my grandfather also lost a parent due to a hate crime. He lived in Minsk. They had lots of brothers and sisters. The family owned a tavern, and his father was walking through the woods, had money on him. He was robbed, and he was also killed. And the killing part was a total hate crime. It was never investigated. And my grandfather's, his mother first died of an illness. Then there was a stepmother, she died of an illness. So basically they got like 7, they got a lot of kids there, and they're pretty much orphaned. And it's a much wilder story, which I had a lot of fun imagining, because they started running the tavern. Which you imagine these young people in Minsk, they got this tavern, they're running it until an aunt comes and tries to do what she can. So he comes here and they marry. And I think the most interesting, part of my book, an unusual part of the book, is in 1931, they go back to the Soviet Union. They go back to Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. My mother's 5. My aunt is 3. They sell everything. They borrow money. And it was my grandfather's dream to build the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's the Depression here. There's no work. It's horrible here. And I did, a tremendous amount of research to really imagine what would it been like in 1931. I also, they stayed, 9 months, and they were really lucky that they got out of there, because there's no way if they had stayed any, the purges of 1936, just anyone who was there who came, whether they were Russian Jews or other Americans, they were killed, they were put in the labor camps. And somehow my book looks at, I think, a very unexplored aspect of Jewish history. There's so many Russian Jews, went back, and fortunately, my grandparents didn't stay. And I really look at what was it like? And I met many, many composite stories of people who went back. The Yiddish socialist Jewish dailies in America were saying that life was great there. And it was really shocking. They would have most certainly, have lived in a communal apartment with like 20 families, 1 bathroom. If they were lucky, maybe they would have had 2 rooms. The food shortages, it was actually a famine going on in the Ukraine at the time. So they had the peasants coming into Leningrad just to escape the famine. It was, an incredibly difficult time. And I really try to imagine, what it must have been like for my grandmother to be back there. And then so the book is looking at at these different time periods. And then, of course, it is then based, I had an incredible opportunity in 1980 as a college student. I spent 3.5 months in Moscow as a Russian student, studying Russian at the Pushkin Institute. And I had an unbelievable opportunity to meet, many Soviet Jews who changed my life, who I have spent, all these years in writing the book and trying to figure out the right form for this book, and in researching the book, reflecting on that experience. Again, how that journey, each of these no one is ever the same. And, their graciousness, their courage. I had a very unusual opportunity to meet many of the Soviet Jews who were trying to practice Judaism, which was a very difficult thing to do in 1980. That was a very rebellious thing to do. They were risking, tremendous persecution to practice Judaism. I had the opportunity to be at the only operating synagogue in Moscow on Rosh Hashanah. And, I describe a black car that came to disperse the crowd, to intimidate the crowd. And I was just so moved by their incredible courage and graciousness. Nobody ever thought the Soviet Union was going to fall. That was never, ever, ever and on anyone's radar, I have to say. And my book starts out with a young Anna who she's on her way to Moscow. This is a work of fiction in 1980, as I said, to study Russian language as a college student. Her mother thinks she's absolutely crazy to go. Her grandmother, who came to the US, as I said, from the Ukraine, tells her, "Good luck, you'll need it." So, the first words of the book are, "Your problem is you have a Russian soul," that her mother tells her. So she's pretty terrified, and yet somehow it becomes a journey, that completely, changes her life. And I spent forever trying to write it. I just wanted to say, briefly that, it was, I feel like it's been amazing writing the book. It's was written many, many different ways until it came out right. And I feel, very, very happy it's out. And I feel especially it chronicles a very important part of Jewish history. I just want to end by reading just one page. This is the page when they approach Leningrad. It's 1931. The ship approached the city on an autumn night in late September. The lights from the boat shimmered on the water. Leningrad, so beautiful in the distance. Sarah had never seen anything like it before. There were large cobblestone squares and faded yellow buildings, symmetrical in form and appearance. On the ship, she had overheard that the Tsar's palaces had become museums. Others said she would find statues everywhere of Lenin, Stalin, Pushkin, Dzerzhinsky. She started to weep, not knowing why or where her tears came from, only that she had returned to her homeland and was not prepared for the feelings welling up within her. Once the boat entered the harbor, Sarah thought she heard her mother calling to her in the rain that fell softly, creating a mist over the city. On the ship, no one spoke. They just peered at the city in front of them. Thank you very much. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Everybody can clap or put your little clap symbol in the thing. I have to say, Lisa, that's what also, when I read about your book, that's what caused me to, say, yeah, I want to order this one, because I didn't know anything. I didn't know that there were Russian Jews in America who had made it to America and then they decided to go back. So that was fascinating for me.
Yeah, a lot of them.
So, okay, great. So, and I think all three of our authors tonight did a tremendous amount of research. So we'll get to that in the questions. Next, I want to introduce Lori Banov Kaufmann. Before becoming a full-time writer, Lori was a strategy consultant for high-tech companies. Hello, like me. She has an undergraduate degree from Princeton University and an MBA from Harvard Business School, and she lives in Renana and has 4 adult children. And Rebel Daughter is her debut novel, and it just came out, was it 2 weeks ago, Lori? Something like that. Wait, I gotta unmute you. Hold on. Sorry, should have done this first. Okay.
Okay. Hi. Do you hear me?
Yep, take it away.
Okay. First of all, this is my first live event, so I'm very excited to be here, a little nervous. My book only came out a couple of weeks ago, so it's just the beginning of this journey of introducing it to readers, and it's very, very thrilling to see people that have read the book and who want to read the book, and to have the opportunity to talk about the book to new people, because my family is totally sick of hearing about this. So it's great to have a new audience. The book is about a young woman who is taken captive after the fall of the Second Temple in first century Jerusalem in the year 70. She's sold as a slave in Rome, and her master, who's fallen in love with her, has set her free. And what's unique about this story is a few things, but the main thing is that it's based on real characters. And the events, the historical events, the political events that are described in the book actually happened. I worked on the research and putting the story together for more than 10 years. And I consulted with some of the world's leading scholars, historians, and archaeologists about this period, because I really felt an obligation to get it right, to the real characters whose story I was telling, and also to bring this period to life, because it's so long ago, and you can't just have characters from today and describe olive press and presto, you're in the 1st century. There was just so much more that I had to imagine to bring their story to life. So it was a lot of research to get that part down. My inspiration was the discovery of a 2,000-year-old gravestone in southern Italy of a Jewish woman named Claudia Astor. And when this gravestone was discovered, it was a big archaeological discovery and a lot of press because it was the first corroboration that there were Jewish slaves who were brought to Rome after the destruction of Jerusalem. And it also showcased this very, very unusual and unlikely romance and relationship. You had a Roman freedman who is begging the living to take care of the remains of the woman he loved. And it was such an emotional epitaph that it really kind of rocked the archaeological world for a while. And people wanted to know more about this story. And I certainly did. I wanted to know who was this Jewish woman? How does a Jewish woman from Jerusalem end up as a freed Roman slave, and with her owner, professing his love for eternity? And I just wanted to know how two people who came from nations that were fierce enemies, how they ended up falling in love and finding each other. So I was drawn in by the love story more than, I'd say, an interest in the 1st century or in ancient history. I've loved historical fiction always, but for me, that kind of ended, World War II, or I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. I grew up there. So the Civil War was something I knew existed, but beyond that, nothing. So I really didn't know much about 1st century. But as I started learning about it, it just became so interesting because, first of all, the little I did know, I realized turned out to be wrong. And when you look at it from a historical perspective, as opposed to a religious perspective, things look a lot different. This was a time when Rome ruled the world, from Europe and Britain all the way down to Africa. It was, the empire, and they crushed any hint of opposition immediately, without mercy, with their disciplined, and well-organized army. And here you have a bunch of Jews in a small province on the eastern edge of the empire, declaring war on the greatest empire of the world. And it just doesn't make sense. This is a bunch of Jews, again, who decide, okay, we're going to declare our own state. Jerusalem's going to be the capital. And we're rebelling against the Roman Empire. Meanwhile, there's no army. What would motivate people to do this? And looking into the religious fanaticism of the time and the intense nationalism was such an interesting process, not to mention all the parallels that I still saw today. But that kind of sucked me in a lot more than I anticipated. Again, I was drawn to the story because of the personal love story, and I wanted to flesh that out. But in the meantime, I became totally say, obsessed by the first century and wanted to know what life was like what was like there. So that was, I think that's enough of a background, for now. And I do have a scene that I wanted to read. It's in the beginning of the book when Esther is very young when the story starts. She's 14, and she's talking with her cousin about the things that first century girls talk about. Again, let me just pause by saying part of my challenge was to make the characters come alive in a way that we could relate to them today, because even though the world was so different, people were very much the same. They wanted to live their lives in freedom and dignity. They wanted to protect their families. They wanted to find love. Those are all things that we can relate to on a personal level. And there was so much more that I had to, bring in so that people could experience it. But I think that connecting to the characters on a personal level was a part of the challenge. But that was actually easier than understanding how people lived and cooked and what they wore and the sort of daily things. I felt like with people, I understood a little bit more. Esther lay on her back on the grassy slope outside their home, her arms cradling her head. Spiky blades of grass tickled her neck as she looked up at the dark sky. "I don't see any," she said to Miriam, her sister-in-law. They were looking for angels. "That doesn't mean they're not there," Miriam, her sister-in-law said. She was 5 years older than Esther, so she knew things like that. They fell silent. The staccato song of cricket wings crackled in the air. After a few moments, Miriam spoke. "I'd like to be invisible, like the angels." Esther wasn't surprised. Miriam, married to Esther's brother Shimon, wore the same dung-colored robe every day and hid her silky hair, the color of roasted chickpeas, under a scarf. Esther turned to face her. "Me too, especially when mother wants water from the well or dung for the oven." "You're complaining? You stretch out under the fig tree instead of threading the loom and spit pomegranate seeds until your mouth turns red." "I don't spit seeds." "But you could," Miriam said, her voice rising. "That's the thing, you could. What can a married woman do without everyone clicking their tongues and shaking their heads? Enjoy your freedom while you can." She pursed her lips. 2 frown lines were etched on her face, from the corner of her lips to her bulbous nose. Her deep-set eyes gave her a permanently doleful look. "You'll be betrothed before the next harvest." "Father said it's time, but I'm not ready yet." "What if they marry me off to some 30-year-old? "There are advantages to an old husband. The oil merchant's daughter married a man from Jericho with 43 years. She lives in a big house on the East Hill, and he buys her everything she wants. She has a copper mirror and alabaster bracelets." "Father says I need someone wise like Solomon and humble like Moses." Esther twirled a blade of grass between her thumb and forefinger. "Mother says I should marry someone like Jacob, rich." "And who do you want?" "No one, at least not yet. I'll die if I have to spend my whole life spinning and making beds and babies." Miriam was silent, then asked in a soft voice, "What's wrong with that?" Esther filled her lungs with the resinous air, heavy with pine. "The only thing I know is that my husband will be a Jew from a priestly family." "That's obvious," Miriam said. "What else could he be? A Roman?" Esther laughed at the thought. "I wonder when my father will find my perfect man." "Every man is perfect until he's your master." Miriam tore off the needle-like awns of the weeds. "Then you have to worry about pleasing him and his mother. You grind the flour, make his food, and wash his feet. You have to worry about bringing children into the world. What if you don't have any? He'll divorce you. He can, you know, if you don't give him children. Esther knew that Miriam prayed to God to fill her womb and saved scraps of cloth in the bottom of a wooden chest to swaddle a baby. God will give you a child, Esther said. Miriam got up. Maybe, but what if it doesn't survive the journey from the womb? Or I'm split apart by birthing pains or give birth to a snake child. Or maybe a miracle happens and you deliver a baby who is healthy and whole, and he falls down the stairs or tumbles from the roof. Maybe the evil spirits will sink their teeth into his young flesh. Or your husband dies and leaves you a widow. Stop! Esther put her hands over her ears. Why did Miriam always ruin everything with her constant worrying? I don't feel like looking for angels anymore. Miriam swatted at the leaves and the straw clinging to her tunic. Me neither. Oh.
Very nice. I really that's one of the things I really liked about the book, among others, was the friendship between Miriam and Esther, and they're actually cousins, right? And sister-in-law.
Right. I took out a little bit from the scene just so it wouldn't be too confusing, but there's a lot about family relationships and family in the book, in addition to the overall political story.
Great. Well, that's something we can all relate to, all the different characters in the family but I'll let people read it themselves. Okay, thank you, Lori. Okay, next up is Jennifer Rosner. Wait, let me unmute you, Jennifer, while I'm giving you the intro. Hang on. Jennifer Rosner is the author of The Yellow Bird Sings, called exquisite, heartrending, an absolute beautiful and necessary novel by the New York Times Book Review, and a finalist for the 2020 National Jewish Book Award. Her previously published books include the memoir, If a Tree Falls, A Family's Quest to Hear and Be Heard, and the picture book, The Mitten String. Jennifer received her BA from Columbia University, yay, and her PhD from Stanford University, and she lives in Western Massachusetts with her family. So take it away, Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Julie. This is such a great event, and I'm so happy to be sharing the stage screen with Lisa and Lori. So The Yellow Bird Sings, which has a lot of different covers. I saw you had the one that was the UK cover. I don't know if you can see this one. This is a story about a mother and her 5-year-old daughter who are hiding in a farmer's barn in Poland during World War II. And the girl is musical. She feels music pulsing inside her, but she has to be completely silent in the barn. And she ends up conjuring a magic bird who can sing out the music in her head and in other ways enact a childhood she can't have. And her mother, in an effort to pass the minutes and hours and days, whispers stories about a little girl and her bird who avert threats and find safety. But then, meanwhile, there are very real threats just outside the barn. The farmer's children try to get into the barn. There are neighbors who would denounce Jews to get a bag of sugar. Soldiers are walking by day and night. And as the dangers mount over the course of months, the mother is forced to make an impossible choice about whether to find a different hiding place with her child or else to put her child in a safe haven apart from her. I should mention that the child's name in the English version is Shira, which when it's translated into Hebrew, which it's going to be with Arya Near Publishing, we need to come up with a non-modern name for her. I chose Shira because it means song. And so I'm looking at names like Fagala or Tzipora. And anyway, I wanted to ask this audience to please advise, especially those who have maybe read this novel, to help with that, because we're trying to find the right name for my child. I'm going to read a passage early on in my conversation, just to give you a sense of the book, and then talk a bit about what inspired me to write it and the research, etc. So this is just the prologue. The girl is forbidden from making a sound, so the yellow bird sings. He sings whatever the girl composes in her head, high-pitched trills of piccolo, low-throated growls of contrabassoon. The bird chirps all the musical parts, save percussion, because the barn rabbits obligingly thump their back feet like bass drums, like snares. The lines for violin and cello are the most elaborately composed, rich and liquid smooth, except when fear turns the notes gruff and choppy. Music helps the flowers bloom. When the daisies grow abundant, the bird weaves a garland for the girl to wear on her head like a princess, though no one can see. She must hide from everyone in the village, soldiers, the farmhouse boys, the neighbors too. The lady with squinty eyes and blocky shoes just dragged a boy down the street and returned, smug and straight-backed, cradling a sack of sugar like a baby. When giants tromp past, the bird holes up in a knot in the rafter, silent and still. Tending the garden must wait. The girl, music trapped inside, buries herself under hay. She imagines her mother whispering their nightly story, or whisper singing her favorite lullaby. She holds tight to her blanket and tries to fall asleep, sniffing in vain for the faded scent of home. So the inspiration for this story came years ago. I think we all are long haul novelists in this crowd. So I came to writing pretty late in my life, actually. I was a philosophy professor, and I had my first child, and she was born deaf, which was quite surprising. I didn't know that we had any history of deafness, and as it turned out, after a bunch of research, I found that we did, and I'll get into that a bit later. But yeah, I had been doing this like kind of abstract theoretical work about the nature of self, where, you know, there are probably like 5 other scholars who cared about the very tiny details of what I was working on as a philosopher. And when our daughter Sophia was deaf, you know, we were faced with a lot of like real life questions about communication modalities and, you know, how we were raising our child, whether to be in a hearing speaking world or a signing world, et cetera. So I ended up for the very first time just journaling. I had never really done that, just to try to get a hold of my feelings and our decisions, et cetera. Found it very, very nourishing and really loved writing so much. And those snippets eventually became a memoir called If a Tree Falls, which was about, you know, our journey raising our daughters and finding in my ancestry deaf relatives going back to the 1800s. And I was at a book talk for that event. And I was saying how we made a choice for our children to get access to sound with hearing technology, and we were encouraging their every vocalization, when someone in the audience described her childhood experience having to stay completely silent in a shoemaker's attic during World War II with her mom. And it was interesting, in this person's experience of needing to be silenced. It was so different from how we were trying to work with our children to make sound. And I just really kept thinking about her and her mother. And I ended up getting in touch with her and interviewing her and meeting through her many hidden children of the Holocaust. And so I did interviews with people who had all kinds of different experiences hiding. So some were in, you know, attics and barns and tiny spaces, some were in the woods, some were hiding in plain sight on farms, etc. And all of these stories, you know, full of so much ingenuity and resilience. They were, you know, with details that, you know, they're like too strange for fiction sometimes. If I had come to an editor with some of those stories, they'd be like, that's ridiculous. But in fact, that was a lot of what I was hearing. But I ultimately set all of their stories aside, because I was thinking maybe they'll write their story, or maybe their child or grandchild would write their story. And I wrote my own story about a musical child and her yellow bird, and all kinds of details that went into my particular novel. And I thought I would just talk to you a little bit about the process of research where, you know, I had written draft, and I live in Massachusetts. I was on, you know, at our dining table or in the window seat or whatever, trying to imagine what was going on, and finally decided it was really important for me to sort of cross-check some of the information, especially, you know, because I was getting it sometimes online, or I was walking in Google Maps down certain roads, etc. So I ended up finding a guide in Poland who read my manuscript in advance and brought me, actually my eldest daughter came with me. We went to the settings of my novel, which were really, it was incredible because I got to see so many I don't know, details, sensory details that I got to add to the text. We went to an area of farmland, for instance, where there were barns, much like the one my character might have been hidden in. And, you might think on a farm, there might be easy enough to hide a person because there's a lot of land. But in fact, the way the farms are set up are, very, like the houses are quite close together and the farmland goes back in these narrow swaths, because for community reasons, you did need to be close to your closest neighbors. So it was actually very, very hard to be hiding a person in your barn. Plus there were people who were always watching and somewhat nosy, like even when we were there, the guide took us to see a very beautiful Orthodox church, by the way. And, someone, when we came back to our lodging, some townsperson was like, why'd you turn left out of the parking lot and not right? So people were watching, and I thought that must have been very hard for my characters to be hidden in this way. It was very complex. We got to see a convent where Jewish children were hidden, and we went to a swath of primeval forest where partisans had camped. So all these different details, like the smell of mushroom soup as you walk into the convent, the sound of your feet on the stone. I mean, all these things. And also the forest where one of my characters has to hide in winter, much to my daughter's horror, that I set my novel in winter in Poland for part of it. And that's when we went to travel so that I could understand how my character would survive. So she told me, please set my next novel in Greece or somewhere, some climate that she'd like to come with me to. But in addition to Poland, I also went to Tel Aviv, and I went there. My character's this violinist, and her grandfather's a violin maker, and I was lucky enough to visit Amnon Weinstein's workshop in Tel Aviv. I don't know if any of you have been there. It's so inspiring. Amnon Weinstein has reclaimed violins that have been, were from Holocaust times, and he's rebuilt them, and they're played all around the world in orchestras called Violins of Hope. And for a violinist, who's wearing down the instrument in a certain way with the pressure of their own body, if that fingerboard stuff is left the same, I mean, when you replay that instrument years later, it's like bringing back the voice of that player. It was really moving, and kind of incredible thing. And I was very lucky to get to visit him and see all these beautiful inlaid star-backed violins, as well as a violin he received that had ashes inside, which he decided not to open and rebuild. But yeah, that's just a bit of it. I mean, I chose the violin for really personal reasons because my dad had played violin every day of my life, and my dad died a little bit before my novel came out. But I think he taught me the connective power of music and the transportive power of music. And the other thing is that in my research of deaf ancestors, one of the really most important details I learned was that these two great aunts of mine, when they went to sleep at night, they would tie a string from their wrist to their babies in the night, so that in the darkness, if the baby cried, they would feel a tug on their wrist and wake to care for their child, which was this incredible innovation of mothering, of connection, of hearing. And one thing, I think I picked a string instrument as a connection between this child and her family. It was like a string in the night in some way, as a kind of homage to my ancestors. But also, one thing I want to say as a writer is that I find it so amazing that you set out to write a story and you don't always know why you're doing it. And what I found each time is that everything gets turned on its head. Like, I was writing a memoir about my deaf daughters, thinking that what I was trying to figure out is, whether they would hear and how that would work. But ultimately that memoir was about whether I would hear them. I think I learned about this ancestry and the strings wrist to wrist. And I wondered if I had a string from my mother to me and whether there was a string from me to my daughters. I felt somehow that maybe there, I hadn't really had such models of hearing and that I needed those for my children. So it's like the whole thing opened up to be about my possible deafness and how I'm going to hear. And I find that happens with writing all the time. I was writing this story about a mother and daughter hidden in a barn. And I think it's all about this longing connection, the longing for a mother to be with her child. That is me as a mother longing to be with my children and connected to them. And also the longing, of a child for her mother. That's my longing in some ways. Like there's just all this stuff that kind of comes out as you're going to show you that you don't know so much about yourself yet and that you're going to learn if you keep working at it, and I really value that about writing very much, and found that it was a much more nourishing process for me personally than philosophy, which I still teach in a very particular way to women who have kind of gotten off track and are dealing with a lot of poverty and who are asking these big philosophical human questions. Learning how to critically think, et cetera. But that's kind of the condition under which it feels nourishing to me to teach. But mainly I've been doing mostly writing. So that's a bit about my story, except that, I'm at work on a new project and hoping to learn all the things it's going to teach me. And Julie had mentioned, sometimes people like to know about your process. And I was thinking, I just try to kind of touch the project most every day, because that, I think, consistency with it and just kind of being in touch, keeping it on simmer if it's not on boil, always on simmer at least if you're lucky, right? And then if you're lucky enough, some days it gets boiling. So I do that. And yeah, and basically I'm just really happy that I'm not only reaching the 5 people in the philosophy field who cared about this tiny thing I was working on, but rather able to reach a larger group of people and talk about, things that are important to all of us, so thank you.
Yay, thank you very much. And I totally agree with you on and several things you said, but that the act of writing is really to learn about yourself and what you think. I have to write to figure out why I do some things I do and what I think about certain things. And even after my book came out and I was doing all these interviews and people were asking me like, well, what's the takeaway? I'm like, well, I hadn't thought about, like, while I was writing it, I wasn't thinking, what do I want the takeaway to be? But then it forced me to sit down and think, and it was still kind of a revelatory process even after I was done writing.
Yeah, and
talk about it.
I actually had meant to say, am I muted or am I okay?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, I had meant to say that early on when my book came out, people were saying sort of, what are you taking away from this? And I thought to myself, I thought that the role of creativity and beauty and human survival is really what my book is ultimately about. But I learned that by talking to these hidden children who are now, elderly people for whom the smallest thing, like the scent of tree bark or, just something small, could play a role in helping them go on in a difficult time. And, while there's absolutely no comparison, the fact that a lot of us have been kind of kept in, to a totally different degree with food and puzzles and, et cetera, and but Netflix. Just, but the fact is that art, and creating art and experiencing art and beauty and creativity have played such a role in just kind of getting through this moderately hard time compared. So
100%, mechuz, as we say in Israel, 100%. And that's one of the reasons that I had been doing these literary Modiin things once every couple months, and then I felt that I was like, I guess it was around July, September, like, I gotta do these once a month because that's what I have to look forward to. So okay, yeah, people, please ask some questions. I see we have some coming in. Yes, I will post the list in a minute that of all the books that have been here, and I'll also post the sign up for the March event. A question for Jennifer. How did you decide whether to have a happy ending or a sad ending? And two, the issue of names was what was most compelling to me. Shira's name changes several times and she didn't know her mother's name. I don't want to give anything away, but was this behind the ending? So also, yeah, don't give away any more
I
spoilers.
won't give away. Yeah. Well, let me say something about the names because it was very important to me. Actually, I have to say, I think the philosopher in me really came through with regard to the questions of, nature of self and identity and how it is, how when one's name changes several times, does it affect one's, basic sense of self. And one thing that was inspiring to me is I was at the Holocaust Museum in DC, and there was this program called Remember Me. And this is a very literal program where there are these pictures of people and it says, remember me. And if you did remember me, you would tell me my name and where I came from so that I could figure out who I am and, find my family and figure out who, and, the thing is that there was such a difficulty with hidden children because, many were hidden very young. It was very dangerous to keep track of their Jewish name. So, of course, Irena Sendler had buried some in a garden, in jars in a garden where she had the Hebrew name, their name on one side and then their assumed Catholic name on the other, but that was a small set and some of them were recovered. But ultimately, a lot of kids just lost the thread. They just lost the entire thread of their own name. Their parents were Mama and Tata or whatever. They didn't know who they were, and they get out of the war and there's just no way to track. And the parents can't really track them either. And, they get off a train station, there'd be like a fence tacked with a billion, little pieces of paper fluttering in the wind. This is how it was. I mean, it's hard to remember that because now if you want to meet your third grade friend, you can go on Facebook and find them, but it was so hard. And I thought it was very, very important that we understood how complicated it was for children, during the wartime and how the reunification process was. The other thing about the ending where you ask if it's either happy or sad, my ending, I'm going to try to talk about my ending without talking about it. All I want to say is I think my ending is something of a projection screen for the reader, and that I'm the project I'm working on now explores more fully this subject matter of people coming together after the war. I'd be happy to write privately to the person who asked, but I just want to say that personally I think it's a hopeful ending, but I think it's also ambiguous. But thank you for the question.
Okay, we're getting a lot of good questions. Question for Lisa. Why did you decide to make it a book of fiction rather than an autobiographical text?
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. I get asked that a lot. And actually, the first manuscripts were a memoir. I'm really thankful that when I came back from the Soviet Union, I wrote down everything because it would, so I really have those details of Moscow 1980. And I just, I spent about 5 years writing, and I took a part-time job and lived the life of the starving artist. But I never felt I could quite get it to work. And I also just wanted to say I had this unbelievable writer, maybe some of you know, Esther Broner. She published under E.M. Broner, who I started the book in her workshop. And she's, so it started off as a memoir, and I just want to say just about process. She sent me to a writing colony. I maybe written about 20 pages in a workshop. You got to write this manuscript. So I'm like 23 years old, and I go to this Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. And, I'm like, I've never really I'm like alone in this room. I'm much younger than everybody. I've never faced myself for that long. They delivered lunch outside, I'm like alone for 6 hours in this room. I thought I was going to it was very difficult. I really have to say, I never faced myself. So for such long periods of time, everyone was very nice to me. I was relieved when it was over and I could come home. I did produce a manuscript, but it never quite worked. And I think this is why it took me so long. And what happened over, I put the manuscript down, I did other things. got a PhD and so forth, came back to it. And I realized the fictional form, as I got really interested in this, kind of epic story of the 3 generations and of the story to 1931, and then of the story of the Ukraine, and then the story of Moscow 1980, that the fictional form gave me an opportunity for all the stories to meet and to, really write about it in some kind of epic way, and to write about love in an epic way. And these very important connections. So that's why, after writing it 20 million times, I felt like the fictional form, gave me that freedom. So thank you for that question.
Okay. Another question came in right as I was asking it, but I think you mostly answered it, but you can take a look in the chat, and if you don't think you answered it, you can answer it. But now there's a question for Lori. How is slavery in ancient times different than chattel slavery as it was in the US, for example, so that it becomes reasonable to talk about love? Wait, I have to unmute you. Oh boy. Okay, hold on. I think our panelists, you can stay unmuted if you'd like. It's up to you.
Okay. That's a very, very interesting question. I'm not an expert on ancient slavery, so I can just tell you how it seemed to me. It was very interesting to read about slavery in the ancient world because it was ubiquitous. And one thing that was very troubling to me was that the Jews owned slaves. And in fact, in one of my earlier drafts, I had my character, who later becomes a slave, being a slave owner in the beginning. And because the publisher thought that would be so problematic for modern readers, we had to actually take that out. But there were war captives who became slaves. War captives were automatically made slaves, no matter what their position was prior to, they could have been aristocrats or poor farm people, but if they were war captives, they automatically became slaves of the emperor. There were debt slaves. There was all different kinds of slavery. There were Jewish slaves, and there were Jewish slave owners. So it was ubiquitous. And how do you talk about love when there's such an imbalance of power? That's a very modern concept. People's status was very fluid in the ancient world, and there were a lot of power imbalances. There were, there were things that we can't conceive of today. The difference in, gender relations and slave and owner, and it was very fluid. One of my characters is a war captive, and he becomes a freedman in Rome, and then he's a Roman citizen, and he becomes very wealthy and a nobleman. So there's a fluidity to status in the ancient world that we're just not used to here. So it's an interesting question to think about.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, there's a question for all 3 of our authors. How much, from Michelle, and this is a question from me as well, I guess, from me to you, how much research is too much? Or when does research become procrastination? So why don't you start, Lori, since you're...
Well, I think I went beyond procrastination to obsession. I mean, I really don't think I needed to spend 2 weeks researching how people made face cream in the 1st century, but I wanted so much to tell the story authentically. And I wanted the reader to experience almost a time travel experience reading the book. I didn't want it to just be, you drop a olive press in the background and poof, it's the 1st century. I wanted the reader to feel the heat of the stones through their thin sandals as they're walking up to the temple, and feel the smoke in their eyes and the smell of the animal, the burnt flesh of the animal sacrifices. And I felt to get that level of detail, and that the sensory details that Jennifer was talking about when she looked at the barn, I had to immerse myself in it. And because it was so unlike our world today, I had to check everything out. Just everything was so different. And I felt like I couldn't have my characters almost, do anything without learning how it was done. And I wanted to learn the right way. So clearly I would not recommend this, especially if someone is trying to make a living out of writing. I don't think it was, probably made a lot of sense, but I loved it and it was a labor of love. And I think it makes the book very special.
I'll agree with that. It's the details are amazing. Yeah, there's so much about that time period that I didn't know, or let's put it like 99% of what's in the book I didn't know. So it was fascinating for me.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's turn to Jennifer and Lisa with that question, which when does research, how much research is too much, or when does research become a procrastination? Now I have to unmute you guys. Hold on. Jennifer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I have to agree with Lori that I think that for me, the research was something I loved doing. It was something that really grounds the novel, and I also think we feel responsible. Like, I was working in the Holocaust era, and I felt very that I needed to get I needed to get the history right, but you need to get you want everything to be right, because you just don't want anyone being, in fact, I should say, one thing I did is I fictionalized the names of the Polish towns, because I was making up, that there was a tavern here and the barn was here and it was this many kilometers. And I didn't want people going and being like, actually, there it was 25 kilometers, because it's not at the emotional heart of my story. It doesn't matter how many kilometers, but I was concerned to have anything be false. So in that particular case, I fictionalized it. But I think there's sort of this sense of responsibility about wanting to get things right. And there's a sense about, if you're going to write a scene and you really want it anchored in sensory detail, that it does require a lot of research. And I did have these funny consultations with mushroom foragers and forest trackers and nuns and, all kinds of different historians and musicologists, because I was going through with, I was using a lot of music figures very big in the novel. And I needed to know, if my prodigy, would she learn this piece first and then this other piece, and how would she practice and what would she play? It's not just a normal violin student, but it's, particular type of violin student, etc. I don't know, maybe it's procrastination, but I also think it's just a deepening so that you feel authoritative, so that you feel you can sit down and write. And that's important, to have that feeling that you can kind of move forward, and that you're not in a very thin situation, but rather feel grounded.
Okay, Lisa, should I repeat the question, or you got it?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And I echo what Lori said about it was a labor of love, and what Jen said, that it helps you feel more authoritative. I had written so many pages, and I felt the research really helped me to structure or restructure the book. And I feel like, especially the imagining going back to Leningrad in 1931, some of the research was, I had the opportunity, and these people are no longer alive, but I had the opportunity to meet other people whose parents, like my mother's, went back, and that really helped me ground. And I was able to find different memoirs. I was able to dig out different accounts of people who went back to build a revolution, what happened to them. So I felt like, as Jen said, that I could have some authority. Otherwise, I just felt like, how could I even begin to write this? And, accounts of what the living conditions were like. It was actually really exciting. I felt like I would research and write and research and write. So it deepened the writing. It was, very, very exciting. It made me also understand about the Ukraine and the history going on, just to try and locate, because I really wanted to make each person not just some kind of, I wanted the characters to have this depth of that they were people. They just weren't someone caught in history, but we're all caught in history. And I feel like the research, I really loved it. And I do want to say that there were also people in the family who helped me. My beloved Uncle Al, my cousins are here. He was like the family genealogist, who just, actually gave me a picture of the ship that my grandmother took. That was so unbelievable. And that research is dynamic. It's not just sitting in a library, though I did spend a lot of time in the library, but it's also, talking to people.
I love doing the research for my book also, and it's to get those details right, even if it's not central to the story. Like in one of my stories, I have takes place during the World Series of 1932, and I found the box scores of that game and so there's some details in the story about the actual, like who got a hit and who struck out or whatever. And and I was doing a book event with a friend of mine's a rabbi in Las Vegas, and he did this book event at his shul, and so nobody had ever asked me about that story before. And then I realized he's from Chicago and he's a big fan of the Chicago Cubs. It was a game between the Yankees and the Cubs that took place in Rosh Hashanah in 1932, and he's like, "Yeah, I didn't know that the World Series took place on Rosh Hashanah, so I looked it up to see if it was right, and you were right." And so I felt so like gratified that, oh, see, somebody is going to check, right? So just a little example. Okay, so more questions. Where did you all start with your research? Written, oral, and visual primary sources, and secondary, particularly if the time is so long ago? Who wants to take that one?
I can
I would
take that one.
Where you go.
Okay. I started with Josephus, who the ancient Jewish Roman historian, who was an eyewitness to and participant in all the events. And he's also a character in the book. So that was, my main source. And even though there's a lot of exaggerations and inaccuracies in his account, it really is the prime source for both historians and fiction writers, anyone really writing about the period. But I was very lucky because I had a partner in my research. I worked very closely with the chairman of the history department, Professor Jonathan Price, who is an expert on Josephus and this time period. And he gave me the books and, guided me, introduced me to many of his colleagues. And that was a lot of fun having a historian to work on. And probably one of the reasons why my standards were much higher than if I had been just, working with my, a fiction critique, group. But we had to get every detail right, down to the day and to the hour when these things happened. So, you're talking, Julie, about, well, if someone's going to check you. I'll be very curious because Jonathan checked this over pretty carefully and he knows his stuff, but it did bring it to a higher standard. And my idea of the ideal reader was the reader at the time I was working, or these experts that I was talking to, and I'm thinking, what are they going to think when they read this? So I really put a lot of pressure on myself to check everything. But luckily, like I said, I think people are what. And Jennifer, also you consulted with the people that lived through these events, and you also, Lisa, I mean, that's the research with history. As much as you can, is you want to find people who either know about it or who were there and can tell you what happened.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I started because I happened to meet this hidden child, somewhat haphazardly. I feel like, my writing projects, I just fall in because of life experience or something that's happening. But that one hidden child led me to another. And then, eventually, I decided I should go traveling. And one thing I'll say too about meeting someone on the ground in Poland to talk to was, I had named initially the mom character was named Anya, and he said this, it's a reasonable name for a Jewish Polish woman, but it has an economic connotation that I don't think your character has. which was such an insight and something I never could have known if I was like, there's this site called Behind the Name, and it tells you a lot about names, et cetera, and what would be a reasonable Polish name, you know, et cetera. But economic connotation, I mean, this is like a fine grained detail that only, you know, someone kind of right there would know. So I don't know. I think that as far as, for me, it was somewhat of a circuitous route, and all of a sudden I'd realize I need to know about this. So then I start researching this, and then I would move, you know, it kind of, I just went where it led me to a large extent. So it wasn't very systematic. But I do think that trying to follow up on everything felt really important to me as well. You know, and so that if someone does know these things, that it won't like clang with them, you know, that it'll feel, you know, right and reasonable, et cetera. Even if you say this is a work of fiction at the front, you know, you want it to feel it's a historical fiction.
Okay.
Great.
You want to add anything, Lisa? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one of the most fun things in the researching was discovering that there were these letter writers, the Briefenstelfer, and they were these, and I got this from this amazing book, Dear Mendel Dilrazel, Yiddish Manuals from Russia and America, and they were actually professional letter writers. And you could get these manuals, and it helped people who couldn't write, you know, write letters to each other. So the models, they were hysterical. They were that was one of the most fun things reading through them. And they would start off like these, you know, they'd be writing to their husband, and, you know, if the husband went first to America, to my dear beloved and cherished wife, you know, Reza, you know, Shumansky, and it was like with an exclamation mark. It was just like so funny. And also the way it was signed, your dear beloved husband who misses you so, you know, and then it would, you know, but you had to realize that it was a model. And that, you know, they would actually be looking through a manual. Okay, husband in America, you know, misses his wife, things are hard, and okay, I got it. And I'll just put a few little personal things. And, you know, so I have like these letters in the book, and that was so much fun, you know, and a lot of the research actually ended up being a lot of fun. Just quickly, someone had asked, you know, did I feel that I lost some of the family history through the by making it fiction? And I just wanted to say, I actually think the fictional form helped me get closer to it, because I knew the outline of the family history, which I, you know, went into in my presentation. And this way I could then infuse it with my imagination, but based on research. You know, where was Sarah when all this was going on? You know, what was their relationship of mother and daughter like? You know, all the kinds of things. You know, what was it like for her to be on that ship and to come here? So I actually felt that the fictional form gave me more freedom to get at the truth.
Okay, Jeff Leonard has a question. Balzac was said to have inquired on his deathbed as to the health of some of the main characters in his books. The main character in my most recent novel, which, Jeff, you'll have to tell us the name of your novel, became very real, so real that she has in some ways become a part of my life. Did you authors have similar feelings in the construction and fleshing out of your own characters? Everybody's shaking their heads yes. Who wants to? Anyone want to speak to this?
You know, definitely that the characters became so real, and, you know, that even though they were, you know, based on family history, I never met them, but I feel like I know them. And even sometimes, you know, fact and fiction get so blurred that the character name was Leon based on my grandfather. And, you know, recently for a podcast, I sent in some photos and I called him Leon. I realized, no, his name was Boris. That's his fictional name. So I had to change it. That's how like close. And it was, you know, so definitely. And I think the most fun part of any writing is when the characters all of a sudden pop out of the page and they just start talking to each other. And I think that's, you know, I guess that's, as Jen said, when things are starting to boil.
Someone asked me a couple of days ago if my characters ever surprised you, did anything you didn't expect them to do, and I said, "Are you talking about my characters or my children?" And you know, in a lot of ways, they're alike, and of course, they do become part of you, I think.
Yeah, I feel that way too. That they have become part of me, and now I'm working on a new novel, and I find myself thinking about these new characters that are in my life now. And I had to admit to a friend that I think I'm falling in love with one of them. So I guess it's that person's taking shape for real. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, does anybody have any other questions? I can allow you all to unmute yourselves. Let me see how I do that. If anybody wants to ask a question, wait. Oh, ask. If anybody would like to unmute and ask a question now, I think you can do it. In the meantime, I'm going to put the link again for our March event in the chat. Oh, here's a question. If faced with a conflict between facts and stories, who wins? It's facts and story, who wins? That's a great question. Anyone want to take that?
For me, it was easy. It was definitely the facts. And the facts were so great that I didn't actually have to, I did have to make one change. I had a scene where the Jews were building the Colosseum, which was in fact true, but it didn't work out with my timeline because the Colosseum was built a few years after. And I so wanted to leave that scene in, but in the end, I didn't want to sacrifice the being able to say everything that happened in this book could actually have happened, you know, at least from a historical perspective. So with a heavy heart, I let the facts win. But I think that's probably not a decision that most fiction writers would make. But I wasn't a fiction writer, and I wasn't a historian either. I'm just making it up myself, but I was definitely more in the factual camp.
I was going to say, I think that sometimes the way, like what Lisa was saying, sometimes you can get to truth through fiction in a way that you may not when you're sticking to facts. And I think that for me, there was like the heart truth of the story, kind of the relationships, and other things. And I wanted to honor those. And if I needed to, I wouldn't say that I would let facts go. I would say I'd rearrange things so that I made sure I was getting to the heart of the story. And for perhaps there would be an omission of other facts, or I'd change the time frame a little bit or something in order to get this story itself to have the truth I needed it to have.
Yeah, I guess I didn't feel a conflict, thank goodness. I felt that the more I could learn, the more it gave me the feeling that I could write the story and explore the people in the story and imagine them.
There's a question for all of you. If there are discussion guides for your books. And
yes, absolutely. You can find them on my website, www.forgetrussia.com. Absolutely.
I'm going to send around tomorrow. I send around an email to everybody who registered with the links to the author's websites and any other links. So we'll make,
Yeah, there's a discussion guide link within my website on the Yellowbird Sings page that it says reading group guide, and you can click on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also have on my website and also on the Jewish Book Council website some questions and some great recipes from the first century on my website too, which are kind of fun for book clubs.
I'm sure I speak for all of them. You know, I'm happy to zoom into a book club. That's the good thing about books,
Yeah.
and I'm sure my fellow writers do the same thing.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay, Debbie Levinson is asking, do you want to talk about your journey to being published? Lisa, go ahead.
Sure. I have to say, I'm so excited, to have my book out. And I received, as I was saying, I rewrote it and wrote it many, many, many times over the course of decades. And I received many, many, many rejections. And I probably received so many rejections, I could wallpaper a room with them. And yet I persevered and said, I believe, I'm just going to keep trying. This is my dream. And sometimes, I went back, I reworked it, I rethought it. And I'm really excited. The book is published by Tailwinds Press. It's a very excellent and small press. I really love the job she did. She's actually, the publisher is a Harvard Law School graduate turned publisher. And she's an amazing editor. I love the cover. And, but I mean, what I would say is that you just have to keep trying, and that you just have to just keep persevering and don't give up. Don't give up. Just keep trying. Don't ever give up.
I'm into that. Lori, you want to talk about your path to publishing? And also, Lori, you had told me separately that the publisher asked you to change it to be a YA book. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Right. I didn't write the book as a YA book, and was very surprised that Penguin Random House wanted to publish it under their YA division, but it's more, they call it YA crossover. It's very much an adult book, I think, with very mature themes, but I think it was more for marketing purposes, that they felt that YA books may have more of a longer shelf life, perhaps, if they get into the schools. And because the age of the protagonist when the book starts is a young adult, that it fit into that. But there's a real trend now, I don't know if it's because of Harry Potter or whatever, that a lot of, I think the lines between the different genre or the different age categories are very blurred. The Book Thief, if many of you probably read that, was published originally as a children's book. So I don't really consider it, only for a certain age group. I think that when you read a book, depending on who you are, and even the same person, if you read the book at different points in your life, you get different things out of it. I think that, a more mature reader would probably have a more nuanced, layered view of what they're reading than maybe a younger teen who would read it just for the action and the war story, or say just for the love story. It's that I'm trying to think about the publishing process was very quick for me, actually, but the writing process was very long. So it evened out. I only started writing when I turned 50, and it took 10 years. And then after the publisher took it, it was, I had to wait 2 more years to see the book. They delayed the publication date, and the pandemic. And so just such a long process. And I would just like to say what Lisa, echo Lisa's sentiment that it just takes a long time, and you just have to, giving up is not an option, especially after you've put in so much time, but it just does, everything takes a very, very long time.
Yeah. I'll say that I've had an interesting journey, I think, because I was in academia. I worked on an anthology that ended up with an agent because there were some kind of big names in the anthology, and this agent ended up handling my memoir, but then really disagreed about parts of my novel, and we ended up sort of parting ways. And then in regards to getting The Yellowbird Sings published, because I didn't have an agent yet, and I was kind of, I was sending out queries, but I was also just working on the novel. I ended up sending it to an editor actually at Macmillan who had passed on my memoir, but with the most beautiful rejection letter. She had like said, I just love this writing, but I don't think it's going to be big enough for my list or whatever. And so I said, you gave me the nicest rejection letter. Wondered if you would be willing to read my novel. And she did, and she accepted it on it, without an agent, and then said to me, I'm going to publish your novel. You need an agent, and you can probably pick anyone you want because I'm publishing it or something. So it was a really backdoor and weird thing that happened. I feel like there's a lot of stories like that. It's not always the way you think it's going to go. It's not sort of this formula where, you go on Publishers Marketplace and you seek out agents and then they get a publisher. I mean, sometimes the world is just herky-jerky, and that's how it has been for me, I think, a few times. But I also want to say about that persistence thing, which is that, I think that staying true to what you want to do is also part of it. Sorry about that frog in my throat. And, sometimes your editor will say, well, I think you should cut this big part and add this other thing. And sometimes they're right. And sometimes you feel like they're cutting out what really matters to you. And how do you, like, it's just this process of figuring out what it is you're trying to create and trying as hard as you can to stay true to that while also getting your book out into the world. So I think it's always like a balance of, trying to keep at it and keep with what you think is really important to your work. I mean, by the way, someone asked about a paperback, and mine is coming out this Tuesday with a new.
I have it. The British version is already out.
Oh,
in
that's
paperback.
the British version, and this is the US. Yeah. But in any case, yeah, it's been interesting. And also I worked with, my memoir was with the Feminist Press, which was a small, sort of more independent press. And then I'm with Macmillan, which is kind of a big, one of the big ones. And yeah, there's just all these different avenues and ways to do this, I think. And and there's a lot of luck. There's a lot of amazing books that are in people's computers and drawers that aren't seeing the light, which is such a shame because there are gatekeepers, and it's very, very frustrating. The industry it's hard. It's hard.
Just keep at it.
Keep at it.
I'll just add, so Lisa's book is out in paperback. Lori, when is yours coming out in paperback?
My book just came out 2 weeks ago, so I think it'll probably be a while before there's a paperback version. I think they wait about 9 months, 10 months.
Okay, and this is the last question, and then I'll let everybody go. And it's from my mom. What are you all working on now?
I'll jump in, I guess. I'm working on a novel about a brother and sister who were, after the war, were taken from their rescue home and brought to be redeemed or reclaimed into the Jewish fold. So they are raised by righteous Christians, and they're being pulled back to be raised Jewish. And that actually, as I was saying about circuitous routes, amidst interviewing hidden children, I ended up interviewing an operative who took children. And, some of that taking was negotiating with the families, and sometimes there were court cases, and other times it was just sort of taking kids from the field or, essentially stealing them. I mean, this woman said, I basically kidnapped them and brought them in. And in her view, she was saving the children, saving them after this huge decimation, et cetera, but very complicated emotionally with respect to attachment and identity and sense of belonging and family, et cetera. So I wanted to explore that, and my characters have kind of a bit of different history and how they respond to it. And that's pretty much what I'm exploring right now. In fact, I am in touch with several Israelis, because one of them, this woman, Emuna Gaffney, wrote this beautiful book called Dividing Hearts, all about this. And an Israeli scholar at the Galilee, it's Western Galilee College, I think. He is like an expert in issues around Holocaust studies. He's been really helpful too. So I've been Zooming with Israel a lot lately.
I'll just say briefly that I have plans for a second novel that takes place during the Vietnam War time period.
Lori?
Yeah, well, right now I'm totally focused on seeing what happens with this book. So there's a whole, you know, marketing, just trying to meet readers and learn how this whole thing works, which is nothing I would have ever expected I had to do as a writer. So that's what I'm working on now. But I've started another novel loosely based on my grandmother and her sisters in Charleston, South Carolina at the turn of the century, exploring the questions of how far you will go to, what lengths will you go to fit in, and what makes a real American. I was initially drawn to this period of the 1918, and obviously the flu and the World War I. And I think that's a really interesting time period that I would like to kind of immerse myself in. So that's where I'm going next.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Did I tell you my son lived in Charleston for 2 months last year at the beginning of the pandemic? Yes. So we'll be very interested to read that. Anyway, I want to thank you all. Thank especially Jennifer, Lisa, and Lori for coming and sharing their insights with us. It was a great event. Now I'm going to go back and listen to it again because, when I was busy with some of the logistics, I want to make sure I hear about it. So I encourage everybody in our audience to buy their books, invite them to book clubs, and leave reviews on Amazon and Goodreads. It's very important. And thank you all for coming. And don't forget to sign up for our next event on March 21st. Thanks.
Thank you.
So much. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.